Good Saturday morning, everyone. We're here for the Saturday edition of The Key to Solomon's Key, Secrets of Magic and Masonry, or is this the lost symbol of Masonry? I hope you saw the picture of the Bible that I've got in 1950. I was 9 years old. Anyway, I brought it out for today's event because I was looking something up. I write about getting that Bible in My Life with the Spirits, in case you're interested in scrolling back to see that episode. But anyway, let's now take a moment to examine this story and see what we find when we turn the Bible's light upon itself and excavate below the surface. First, we need to try to determine exactly where the Bible narrative actually starts to intersect with objective, verifiable history. What are the historic roots of Judaism and subsequently Christianity and Islam? Modern researchers have some startling answers to these questions. If the Knights Templar had reason to draw the same conclusions, they were indeed custodians of the most dangerous secret in the world. Let's start with the place and time everyone seems to agree upon. There's little debate between secular historians and Bible scholars concerning the existence and vitality of Judaism as practiced in Palestine during the 1st century BC through most of the 1st century AD. No credible historian dares presume to deny the existence of King Herod the Great, 73 to 74 BC, or his magnificent temple in Jerusalem, or the priesthood that administered the sacrifices, or the existence and influence of cults and sects such as the Sadducees, Pharisees, and the Essenes, all of whom revered a number of scriptural texts that defined their view of Judaism and dictated in exacting detail divine laws and codes of behavior of this magnificent religion. Foremost among these texts are 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. Books that, through their narrative, relate the history of the universe, humankind, and the children of Israel. Tradition holds that the Pentateuch was written by Moses himself. This is tradition holds that it was written by Moses himself around 1280 to 1250 BC, when many Bible scholars compute the dates for the Exodus from Egypt, and that his 5 books were part of the mysterious contents of the powerful and dangerous Ark of the Covenant. Let's look briefly at these 5 books of Moses and try to get a sense of what they are, who wrote them, and where biblical history ends and objective history begins. Genesis begins with the creation story of the world and humankind. It plots our family tree and the great events that link God and his people, from Adam and Eve and the fall of man, through Noah and the great flood, through Abraham, who institutes penis mutilation to distinguish his family and people, and his sons, Ishmael, father of the Arabs, and Isaac, father of the Jews. Through Isaac's twin sons, Esau, who the Bible tells us God hated before he was born, and Jacob, who God loved and later renamed Israel. Then comes Joseph, the son of Jacob Israel, who, after being sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, really showed them all by making it very big in Egypt. Joseph then, in an act of gracious magnanimity, brings Israel, his father, and his entire family, the children of Israel. Now, at the risk of restating the obvious, the term children of Israel refers to the descendants of Jacob Israel, not the former inhabitants of a geographic nation of Israel. Joseph brings Israel, his father, and his entire family, the children of Israel, to the land of the Pharaoh to escape a terrible famine. The book of Exodus continues with the adventures of Israel's family in Egypt. For a while, things are wonderful. Nourished on Egypt's abundance, the 70-odd children of Israel multiply exuberantly and in a few generations become a ponderous population. After a few lean years of famine in the area, they actually become a serious economic burden upon Egypt's dwindling resources. In a ruthless pogrom, the new Pharaoh, who never knew Joseph, orders the firstborn Hebrew males to be slain. The mother of baby Moses places him in a basket and sets it afloat on the river Nile near where the Pharaoh's daughter is bathing. She finds the baby and raises it as her own. So Moses, like Joseph many years earlier, becomes a prince of Egypt. Moses' story is one of high drama and excitement. He discovers his true identity, kills an Egyptian, is banished to the wilderness, has a close encounter with God, and is given magical powers that bring plagues and curses upon Egypt, including the deaths of all the Egyptian firstborn males. Moses is eventually allowed to take the children of Israel out of Egypt. In the next 3 books, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Moses leads the children of Israel for 40 years, wandering the incredibly small, I injected that, incredibly tiny wilderness, and raiding towns and villages. During this time, he receives the 10 Commandments, builds the Ark of the Covenant, and the portable temple to put it in, puts to death a number of wrong-thinking members of the congregation, writes his memoirs, the Pentateuch, codifies laws and ordinances, and institutes the forms and customs of sacrificial worship that must be observed by the people in order to please God. Finally, after a generation of nomadic existence, Moses shows the children of Israel where God wants them to slaughter the natives and settle down, more or less in the area generally known as Palestine. The book of Joshua follows the Pentateuch and continues the adventures of the children of Israel, now identified as a loose confederation of 12 tribes, as they conquer and settle the promised land. But it's the 5 books of Moses that first define Jewish identity as a people, a culture, and a religious entity. Other books of the Old Testament, revered by both Christians and Jews, continue the story of life in the Promised Land, how the children of Israel were ruled for a time by a series of judges, and how a great king, Saul, eventually rose from among them to unite them politically. Saul was succeeded by David, then Solomon, then a string of largely despicable minor kings who would disunite the nation until it fell prey to a series of conquests. The worst of these conquests and dispersals were delivered by Nebuchadnezzar, whose armies destroyed the Temple of Solomon and took the residents of Judah into bondage in Babylon. These books go on to tell the story so familiar to York and Scottish Rite Masons. A story that has an uncanny number of parallels to the tale of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. Only in this case, the Exodus is from Babylon. Here we learn that after 70 years of captivity, the children of Israel were allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple of their God and dwell once again in their own land. Unfortunately, after only 2 generations, the residents of Palestine had no idea who these returnees were. They resented them as invaders and foreign occupiers. The prophet Nehemiah and the highly influential scribe Ezra appeared to have been instrumental in arranging the return of the children of Israel to Palestine. They insisted that it was vitally important that the temple be rebuilt so as to re-establish their cultural identity in the region. According to both Bible and Masonic traditions, excavators and workmen had to work with a shovel in one hand and a sword in the other to fight off the disgruntled locals, whose neighborly requests to be part of the building project had been rudely rejected by the returnees. During the excavation of the ruins of Solomon's temple, workmen discovered in a subterranean vault a scroll containing the 5 books of Moses, something no living person among them had ever seen or read before. This event is the central theme to the Royal Arch degree of York Rite Masonry, where a ritual officer portraying the workman is lowered by a rope into a dark chamber, retrieves the scroll, and delivers the exciting news. I also found this scroll, but I was unable to read its contents. I therefore gave another preconcerted signal and was drawn out of the vault, bringing the scroll with me. We then discovered from the first sentence that it contained the records of the most holy law, which had been promulgated by Moses at the foot of Mount Horeb. Grasping the importance of the discovery, Ezra the scribe had a high platform erected from which he could stand and speak to the multitudes. He caused all of those who had returned from Babylon to be assembled before him and announced that the lost book of the law had been rediscovered, and then he proceeded to read aloud for all to hear the 5 books of Moses. In one of the most dramatic and poignant scenes of the Old Testament, the children of Israel hear for the first time in their lives the actual words of God from God's own book. They hear for the first time who they are and where they came from. They hear why they are God's chosen people. They learn that they are the descendants of Adam and Eve, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel. They hear for the first time the story of Joseph and their bondage in Egypt, of Moses and their exodus, a story each and every one of them can identify with because they've just come out of bondage in Babylon. They learn of their wanderings in the wilderness and how Moses gave them God's laws in the forms of sacrificial worship. They hear why God loves them and has given them this land, because they are the descendants of Isaac and Jacob Israel. And they hear why God hates the unhappy, resentful locals, because they are the descendants of Ishmael and Esau, a gross and hairy man who traded his birthright and any future claim to the land to Jacob Israel for a bowl of lentil soup. After Ezra's reading of the Pentateuch, the people became united in spirit and purpose. The new temple was built. A particular tribe, Levi, was chosen among them to be the priest class. The laws of Moses were instituted and enforced. The sacrifices, practices, traditions of the old religion were resumed, and the people regained their spiritual identity. Ironically, this most dramatic and poignant biblical scene is rarely the subject of sermons, and never, to my knowledge, the subject of a motion picture. Masonry, on the other hand, makes her members think about it a lot. It is at this point in time, approximately 539 BC, when historical and critical scholarly evidence confirms that Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and began to deport and resettle the descendants of Nebuchadnezzar's foreign captives. It's only then, 539 BC, that empirical history starts to hint of the presence of a Jewish people whose center of worship is the temple in Jerusalem. Prior to this, however, there is silence concerning the children of Israel. Our only evidence of Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, Israel, Esau, Joseph and the Egyptian captivity, Moses and the Exodus and wandering, Joshua and the conquest of Palestine, and the kingdoms of Saul, David, and Solomon, our only evidence is the Bible. And in this case, the Bible is demonstrably unreliable history. Thomas L. Thompson, professor of Old Testament, University of Copenhagen, who I conferred with in writing this book. Quote, in writing about the historical development of Palestine between 1250 and 586 BC, 1250 being Moses, 586 being the return from Babylon. In writing about the historical developments of Palestine between 1250 and 586 BC, all of the traditional answers given for the origins and development of Israel have had to be discarded. The patriarchs of Genesis were not historical. The assertion that Israel was already a people before entering Palestine, whether in these stories or those of Joshua, has no historical foundation. No massive military campaign of invading nomadic Israelites ever conquered Palestine. There was never an ethnically distinct Canaanite population whom the Israelites displaced. There was no period of judges in history. No empire ever ruled a united monarchy from Jerusalem. No ethnically coherent Israelite nation ever existed at all. In history, neither Jerusalem nor Judah ever shared an identity with Israel before the rule of the Hasmoneans in the Hellenistic period, approximately that is approximately 200 BC. The Hasmoneans Thomas refers to above were the priest family called the Maccabees, who led a successful and historically verifiable rebellion against the Seleucid kings of Syria in the second century BC, and established an autonomous Jewish kingdom that existed until about 67 BC, when the area was annexed by the Romans. That would mean the tradition of Hanukkah is historically kind of verifiable, but the story of Passover is not. The next obvious questions become, who wrote the books of the Bible where these stories originated? And that's where we'll stop for today. Tomorrow we'll have a little we'll have a little Sunday sermon from the Key to Solomon's Key. I hope that gives you a little food for thought. I think it certainly gave the Knights Templar a little food for thought. So I hope you continue to enjoy your weekend. It's a sweltering day here in Costa Mesa. It's already 80 degrees, and it's only 10:30. And so I'm going to get comfortable. I have a foreword to write to a book for two very dear friends. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. I hope you will be good to yourself today, and be good to your family, and be good to each other. Wear a mask when you leave the house, please. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. See you tomorrow.